The sound of tires screeching against the asphalt echoed through the quiet street as Officer John Harris stepped out of his squad car. The dark night was eerily calm, with only the hum of the city in the distance. He looked at the lone figure walking along the sidewalk, an elegant black woman wearing a sleek red dress that shimmered under the streetlights. Her heels clicked against the pavement with every step she took. John watched her, leaning against his car, his arms crossed. The woman didn't notice him at first, but as she passed by, he couldn't help but make a snide remark, his voice dripping with condescension. "Hey lady," he called out, his tone mocking. "You lost? Or just looking to get yourself into trouble out here?" The woman paused, turned, and gave him a cold look. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady and composed, though there was a fire in her eyes. John chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment. "You heard me. What's a lady like you doing out here in this part of town? Shouldn't you be in a safer neighborhood? You know, somewhere with a bit more class." Her expression remained unchanged, but the tension in the air thickened. She didn't back down, instead taking a slow step toward him. John could feel his grip on the situation slipping. He had no idea what kind of woman he was dealing with. "I'll have you know," she said quietly, her voice calm but cutting, "that your ignorance doesn't bother me. But I suggest you think twice before speaking to anyone like that again." John smirked, about to make another comment when he noticed something strange. The woman's eyes weren't just fiery. They were calculating, sharp, as if she had seen this kind of disrespect before and was used to handling it. He raised an eyebrow, but was about to respond when his radio crackled to life, cutting him off. "Officer Harris, we've got a call for you," the dispatcher said. "Urgent. We need you at City Hall right away." John didn't think much of it. He responded absent-mindedly, still watching the woman in front of him. "Got it. On my way." But before he could turn to leave, the woman spoke again. "You should be careful who you talk down to, officer." John shot her a condescending smile, stepping back to get into his car. "I'll take that advice to heart, sweetheart. But trust me, you don't want to mess with me." As the sound of his engine roared to life, he could still feel her eyes on him. He glanced back one last time before pulling away. He had no idea who she was, but something about her presence unsettled him. The next morning, as John sat in his patrol car, the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio again. But this time, it carried a different weight. "Officer Harris, report to City Hall immediately. The mayor wants to speak with you." John frowned. He had only been to City Hall a handful of times, usually for routine matters. Why would the mayor want to speak with him? The thought didn't sit well with him. He drove to the location with a sense of unease creeping over him. When he arrived, he was ushered inside immediately. His boots echoed in the empty hallway as he was led to a large office. The door was wide open, and John could already see the mayor standing there, a serious expression on his face. But it wasn't just the mayor in the room. Standing by the desk was the woman from last night. The woman he had mocked so cruelly. John froze, his stomach dropping as he realized the situation. The woman's calm demeanor from the night before suddenly made sense. The aura of authority surrounding her was undeniable. The mayor looked up from his desk and gave a slight nod. "Officer Harris, you've met my daughter." John's eyes widened, and a cold sweat prickled his skin. "You're your daughter?" he stammered. The woman stood tall, unbothered by his shock, her gaze unwavering. "Yes," she said coolly, "I'm the mayor's daughter, and I don't take kindly to racist behavior, especially from someone wearing the uniform meant to protect my city." The room was still. John's heart raced. He tried to collect himself, but every word seemed to sink him further into the ground. John began, but the mayor raised a hand, silencing him. "You've made a serious mistake, Officer Harris," the mayor said, his voice low but firm. "And you're lucky we're giving you the chance to explain yourself." John's mind was a whirlwind. How could he have been so careless? How could he have not recognized her? The woman he had mocked so viciously. She was the mayor's daughter, someone with power, influence, and authority far beyond his reach. "Apologies are in order," the mayor continued. "But that's not enough. We will be taking further action." John swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his actions bearing down on him. The woman stepped forward, her voice steady. This city deserves better than a police officer who uses his position to belittle and insult people based on the color of their skin. I'll make sure that doesn't go unnoticed." John's stomach twisted into knots. He had no idea how deep of a hole he had dug for himself. The mayor looked at him one last time, disappointment evident in his eyes. "You will be investigated, Officer Harris. And trust me, we don't take racism lightly around here." John was removed from his regular duties immediately. The investigation into his conduct began that afternoon, and he couldn't escape the weight of the situation. His colleagues avoided him, whispering behind his back. The pressure was unbearable. For days, John stayed in his apartment, unsure of what to do. He had always prided himself on his position as a law enforcement officer, but now, that pride felt like a distant memory. His own arrogance and ignorance had cost him everything. Meanwhile, the mayor's daughter, Veronica, became a figurehead in the city for advocating against police corruption and racial discrimination. She spoke at rallies, attended meetings with community leaders, and made sure that no stone was left unturned in holding the police accountable for their actions. John watched from the sidelines, unable to escape the consequences of his actions. The news covered his case, and the public outrage was swift and intense. He had become a face of everything wrong with the police force. One evening, John saw Veronica at a press conference. She stood tall, confident, and in complete control. She spoke about justice, accountability, and how her father's administration would work to rebuild trust with the community. Her words were powerful, and the crowd hung on every sentence. It was then that John realized the full extent of what he had done. He had mocked the wrong person. He had underestimated her, and now his entire future was on the line. Days turned into weeks, and John's world continued to spiral downward. The investigation into his actions was thorough and swift, as the mayor's office had made it clear that nothing would be overlooked. What seemed like a harmless comment at the time had now become a public spectacle. News outlets across the city were reporting on the incident, with footage of John's interaction with Veronica playing on every station. It wasn't just his career on the line. It was his reputation, his livelihood, and his identity as a police officer that John's phone rang constantly, though he never answered. His colleagues, once friendly and familiar, now avoided him in the hallways. The whispers had grown louder, and some had even begun to express their disgust with his behavior openly. He couldn't escape the stares, the judgment, the silent condemnation. He had always thought of himself as someone who stood for justice. But now, he was being painted as the very thing he despised. Veronica's influence in the city only grew stronger with each passing day. She made powerful statements about reforming the police department, calling for systemic changes to combat racism within law enforcement. She had become a hero in the eyes of many, a symbol of hope for those who had been oppressed and ignored. Meanwhile, John found himself sinking deeper into the quicksand of his own making. One evening, after another round of soul-crushing silence in his apartment, John sat in front of the TV, watching Veronica speak at a rally. She was composed, confident, and passionate as she talked about creating a future where the people who were supposed to protect others actually serve them without prejudice. John felt a pang of guilt so sharp it almost made him sick. But it wasn't just guilt that lingered. It was anger, too. Anger at himself for being so blind, for letting his own biases and prejudices take control of him in the heat of the moment. He had mocked her because of who she was, assuming that because she was black, she didn't belong in the world he inhabited. But now, he realized just how wrong he had been. He could feel his resentment toward her growing as the weeks passed. She wasn't just some victim in his mind anymore. She was a symbol of everything he had failed to uphold in his career. She had become an embodiment of his shame, a constant reminder of his own inadequacies. And she wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting for the power to change everything he had ever believed in. John's world became increasingly small. His friends had distanced themselves. His neighbors gave him nervous, pitying glances when they saw him. And his phone was filled with messages from people who had no intention of offering support. Even his own parents, who had always been proud of his position, couldn't look at him the same way. He was the man who had mocked the mayor's daughter, the man who had failed to represent the people he was sworn to protect. Then came the letter IT arrived late one night, and John almost didn't open it. He had been receiving notices from the department about the investigation, but this letter looked different, handwritten and unsigned. His heart skipped a beat as he broke the seal and began to read. Officer Harris, you don't know me, but I know you. Your actions were a disgrace to everything you claim to stand for, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. The community is watching, and there will be consequences for what you did. But it's not too late to make things right. The mayor's daughter is a force you will not be able to stop. You've made an enemy of someone with power, and that power is only growing. If you want to save yourself from the total destruction of everything you've worked for, you need to do what's right, but it's time to make amends, Harris. Time to show the world you're not the man they think you are. Time to apologize, someone who knows the truth. John stared at the letter for what felt like an eternity. He was certain it wasn't just a random threat. The words hit too close to home. It wasn't just the mayor's daughter, Veronica, who had turned the tables on him. It was the whole city, the whole community that now saw him for who he really was. John spent the entire night pacing in his apartment. He thought about everything, about his career, his family, his choices. The guilt that had consumed him for weeks became unbearable, and he knew that no matter how much he tried to deny it, his life was shattered. The letter had stirred something within him, a need for redemption, even if it seemed impossible. If he was going to salvage anything from this wreckage, he had to face Veronica. He had to apologize, but how? He had mocked her in front of the entire city. How could he possibly expect her to forgive him, especially when she had become a symbol of justice for so many people? She had every right to despise him, to see him as a representative of everything that was wrong with law enforcement. The next morning, John drove to City Hall. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe an opportunity to apologize privately, or a chance to explain himself. The building loomed ahead, imposing and cold, but John was determined. Inside, he was met by the security guard who greeted him with a polite but wary nod. "Can I help you, officer? I need to speak to Veronica Thomas," John said, his voice uncertain but firm. The guard gave him a questioning look, but didn't hesitate. He made a call, and moments later, John was escorted into the mayor's office. Veronica was standing by the window, her back turned to him, clearly lost in thought. She turned when she heard him enter. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something almost cold in her eyes. "Officer Harris," she said, her voice neutral. John swallowed hard, feeling his nerves take over. "I came here to apologize. I made a huge mistake the other night, and I understand if you never want to speak to me again, but I need to say this." Veronica didn't say anything, but the silence between them was palpable. "I mocked you, and I didn't even know who you were," he continued, his voice shaking slightly. "I judge you based on nothing but my own ignorance, and I'm ashamed of that. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I've spent weeks thinking about what I did, and I know that I can't undo it. But I can try to be better. I could do better, and I'll prove that to you." Veronica's gaze softened ever so slightly, but she said nothing. John looked at her, his heart pounding. He didn't know what else to say. He had put himself out there, admitting his mistakes, and now it was up to her. Veronica's silence hung in the air like a heavy fog. John watched her, hoping for some sign that his apology had been received, some flicker of understanding or perhaps even forgiveness. But Veronica remained still, her arms crossed as she considered his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "You've come here to apologize, but what are you truly sorry for, Officer Harris? For mocking me because I'm black? Or for the fact that you're now paying the price for your own ignorance?" John flinched, the sting of her words cutting deeper than he had anticipated. "I'm sorry for both," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I was wrong, and I know my actions were harmful, not just to you, but to everyone who saw it. I let my own prejudices take control, and now I have to live with the consequences." Veronica's eyes narrowed as she observed him. "And what exactly do you expect to happen now? You think a few words can erase what you've done? The harm you've caused to my community, to your own career?" John felt the weight of her questions. What could he possibly say to make it right? He had ruined everything he had worked for, and now, even this small chance at redemption felt like a long shot. "I understand if you don't want to forgive me," John said, his shoulders slumping. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show that I can change. I'll work with the community. I'll go through any training, any process you think will help. I don't want to be the man who made that mistake. Not anymore." Veronica's gaze softened, but there was no sign of complete forgiveness. She studied him for a long moment before responding. "Actions speak louder than words, Officer Harris," she said. "I'll tell you what, show me that you're willing to do the work. Show me that you understand the depth of what you've done. I'm not going to make any promises. I'm not going to pretend like this can be fixed with a simple apology. But I will give you a chance. The ball is in your court now." John nodded, relief washing over him. He wasn't sure what Veronica's decision meant for his future, but it was a step in the right direction. He had been given a chance, a rare opportunity to redeem himself in the eyes of the very person he had wronged. John's path to redemption wasn't easy. It wasn't a simple matter of apologizing and moving on. Veronica had made it clear that words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to prove that he was serious about making amends, and that meant putting in the work. The first step was to attend community outreach programs, where he would work closely with people from various backgrounds, hearing their stories, understanding their struggles. He had always thought of himself as someone who understood the streets, but now he was learning just how much he had taken for granted. Veronica didn't make it easy for him. She set up meetings with local leaders, advocates, and activists who were working toward racial justice. He sat in uncomfortable rooms, listening to people speak about their pain, their frustration, their hope for change. Every conversation challenged his assumptions and forced him to confront the reality of his own biases. He had spent his career seeing the world through a narrow lens, but now he was forced to open his eyes that he also went through racial sensitivity training, something he had never imagined himself doing. The exercises were uncomfortable, and the group discussions often left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. But he understood the importance of it. If he wanted to truly change, he had to be willing to face the things he had ignored for so long. To AT first, Veronica was skeptical. She watched John's every move, scrutinizing his actions and decisions. But as time went on, she started to see a change in him. He didn't just show up at the meetings, he listened. He didn't just go through the motions, he asked difficult questions. He didn't just apologize. He took responsibility one day. After several weeks of community service and personal reflection, Veronica invited John to meet her again. "You've made progress," she told him, her voice cautious but not unkind. "I can see you trying, but I need to know one thing. Do you understand what it means to be a part of a system that has hurt so many people? Do you understand the role you've played in that system, even if you didn't realize it at the time?" John took a deep breath. "I do now. I can't undo the past, but I know I've been a part of something broken, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix it, starting with myself." Veronica looked at him for a long moment, as though she were reading his soul. Finally, she nodded. "That's a start," she said. "But redemption isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous process. Keep showing up. Keep listening. Keep changing." John left that meeting feeling like a different person. It wasn't a complete victory. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild, not just his career, but his life. Months passed, and John's life slowly began to change. He continued his work with the community, attending events, supporting initiatives for police reform, and speaking out against racism wherever he saw it. He became a part of the solution, rather than the problem. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when people doubted him, when they questioned whether he had truly changed. But with every challenge, John grew stronger. He knew that this was his fight now, and he was determined to stay in it for the long haul. Veronica remained a figure of strength and wisdom in his life. They had built an unexpected but respectful partnership. She continued to push for justice, and John continued to push for redemption, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. One day, months after their initial encounter, John was called into the mayor's office once again. This time, The atmosphere was different. It wasn't tense or confrontational. It was hopeful. Veronica looked at him with a small smile. "You come a long way, Officer Harris. And for that, I'm willing to give you a second chance." John's heart skipped a beat. He had worked for this moment, but hearing it from her still carried the weight of a lifetime. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let you down." Veronica nodded. "I believe you." And in that moment, John knew that his journey of redemption had only just begun. He had come face to face with his past mistakes, and while they couldn't be erased, they didn't define him anymore. What mattered now was how he moved forward, how he chose to use his second chance to make the world a better place for everyone, regardless of their skin color, their background, or their story. As John continued his journey of redemption, he realized that the true test was not just how he changed on paper or in the eyes of others, but how he would handle real moments of pressure and challenge. His commitment to doing the right thing was about to be tested in a way he had never imagined at IT happened during a routine patrol, just a few months after he had gained some semblance of trust within the community. John and his partner, Officer Ramirez, were called to a scene involving a group of young black men who were reportedly causing a disturbance. John's pulse quickened as they approached the area, the sound of raised voices growing louder in the distance. As they arrived on the scene, he recognized the faces of the young men. Many of them were from the neighborhood he had been working closely with. They were known in the area, and John had spoken with them during community outreach efforts. He had learned their stories, their dreams, and their struggles. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was personal. The men stood in a circle, some of them laughing, while others appeared agitated. John felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He could feel the eyes of the crowd watching, waiting to see how he would handle it. "Hey, fellas," John called out, trying to keep his voice calm but authoritative. "What's going on here? We got a call about a disturbance." One of the men, a tall figure with tattoos covering his arms, turned to face John. His eyes narrowed, but there was recognition in them. It was Jamal, a young man John had helped at a local youth center. "Officer Harris," Jamal said with a tight smile. "Didn't expect to see you here." John held his gaze. "I'm just here to make sure everything's cool." "What's going on?" Before Jamal could respond, a voice from the crowd shouted, "These cops always harassing us. Ain't nothing going on here, and you know it." John's heart sank. The tension in the air was palpable. He could feel the pressure mounting, the old instincts kicking in. He knew the situation could escalate if he wasn't careful. His partner, Ramirez, stepped forward, but John held up a hand to stop him. This was his moment to show how far he had come, to prove that he wasn't the man he used to be. "Everyone, calm down," John said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to make things worse. I just want to talk, all right? Let's take a step back and figure this out." For a moment, there was silence. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to make a move. Jamal's eyes met John's again, and in that brief moment, John saw something that made him feel like he was finally on the right path. Jamal's expression softened, and the tension in the air started to dissipate. "All right," Jamal said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Let's talk." John let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The situation had diffused, but it wasn't over yet. The crowd was still watching, still unsure of his intentions. He had gained Jamal's trust, but there was a lot more to prove. The conversation that followed was a raw and open dialogue. John listened to the frustrations of the young men, their struggles with the police, the systemic issues they faced every day. He didn't interrupt or try to justify his past actions. He just listened, nodding and acknowledging their pain. When the conversation finally wound down, the mood had shifted. The young men were no longer on edge, and the crowd began to disperse, one by one. John knew that he had just experienced a pivotal moment. He had proven to himself and to everyone watching that he was a different man. He had handled the situation with patience, humility, and respect. He hadn't let his old instincts take over. Instead, he had done the hard work of truly understanding the people he had once been quick to judge. "Thanks, officer," Jamal said as he turned to leave. "You're all right," John nodded. "Take care, Jamal, and stay safe." The change in John's life didn't go unnoticed. Word of his transformation spread through the community, reaching people who had once been skeptical of him. Veronica, ever the tough critic, was among the first to acknowledge his progress. "You handled yourself well today," she said the next time they met. "I'm proud of you." John smiled, though the weight of his journey still lingered. "I'm just trying to do right by the people I used to look past." Veronica studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "I think you're ready for something more." John raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Veronica didn't say anything at first, but after a beat, she handed him a letter. "The mayor has been following your work. He wants to meet with you. He believes you're ready to take on a new role." John's heart skipped a beat. The mayor? He had come so far. Had he really earned this recognition? "I don't know if I'm ready," John said, unsure of what he was being asked to do. Veronica's eyes softened. "You won't know unless you try." The meeting with the mayor took place a week later. It was a tense affair, John sitting across from the city's most powerful figure. The mayor, a middle-aged man with a reputation for reform, studied John for a moment before speaking. "Officer Harris," the mayor began, "I've heard good things about your work. More importantly, I've seen how you've stepped up and taken responsibility for your past mistakes. You've done the hard work, and now I believe you're in a position to help make real change." John listened, unsure of where the conversation was going. "What are you asking of me?" The mayor leaned forward. "I'm offering you a position on the city's community relations task force. You'll be working closely with us to bridge the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. It's a big job, but I believe you're the right person for it." John's mind raced. The responsibility was overwhelming, but the opportunity was one he couldn't turn down. This was his chance to not just redeem himself, but to make a lasting impact on the city he had sworn to serve. "I won't let you down," John said, his voice filled with resolve. The mayor nodded. "I believe you won't." The task force work was demanding, but it was also incredibly rewarding. John found himself involved in policy discussions, community meetings, and events that were actively shaping the future of law enforcement in the city. His experiences in the streets, his transformation, and his commitment to change made him an invaluable asset. He worked alongside Veronica, who had become more than just a mentor. She had become a friend, someone who believed in him when no one else would. Together, they helped spearhead initiatives aimed at reducing racial profiling, increasing police accountability, and fostering trust between the police and the community. Over time, John became a beacon of hope for those who believed that change was impossible. His story, once filled with mistakes and regrets, had turned into a story of redemption and progress. He knew the work wasn't over. There would always be more to do, but for the first time in his life, John Harris felt like he was on the right path. He had learned that redemption wasn't just about making amends for past wrongs. It was about the continuous effort to do better, to be better. And with each step, he was proving that a single person, no matter how flawed, could make a difference. The journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And for the first time in his life, John felt proud of the man he had become. Just as John was settling into his new role on the Community Relations Task Force, a shadow from his past returned. It happened on a crisp autumn evening when he was leaving a town hall meeting. As he stepped outside, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "You really think you can change?" John turned, his breath hitching when he saw the man standing before him. It was Marcus Carter, the very man he had unjustly arrested years ago. Marcus had been a young college student at the time, wrongfully accused of resisting arrest when all he had done was question John's aggressive behavior. That arrest had nearly cost Marcus his future, leading to a criminal record that took years to clear. John had thought about Marcus often, regretting the incident deeply. But he never expected to come face to face with him now. "Marcus," John said, his voice low. "I don't," Marcus interrupted, his eyes filled with anger. "You ruined my life, and now what? You get a promotion for suddenly deciding not to be a racist cop anymore." John swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Marcus's words. He had worked tirelessly to become a better person, but he couldn't erase the harm he had caused. "You have every right to be angry," John admitted. "What I did to you is wrong. I was wrong, and nothing I say will ever change that." Marcus scoffed, crossing his arms. "So why are you here?" To fix your image. John shook his head. No, I'm here because I want to fix the system that allowed me to do what I did to you. I know I can't undo the past, but I can fight to make sure it doesn't happen again to anyone else. For a moment, Marcus said nothing. The anger in his eyes didn't fade, but there was something else there now, a flicker of surprise, maybe even consideration. People like me don't get second chances, Marcus finally said. But you do, huh? John met his gaze steadily. I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm trying to earn it. Marcus didn't respond right away. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped closer. Prove it. John nodded. I will. Marcus didn't forgive John overnight, but their encounter led to something unexpected. Slowly, Marcus became involved in the same community outreach efforts John had been working on. He attended meetings, shared his story, and eventually, they found themselves on the same side, fighting for police reform together. Their uneasy partnership wasn't easy for either of them, but it was powerful. Seeing them stand side by side, one a former racist cop, the other a victim of that racism, sent a strong message to the city. Change was possible. Veronica, watching from the sidelines, smiled one day as she saw the two men in a heated discussion over policy recommendations. She leaned over to the mayor and whispered, "If you had told me a year ago that those two would be working together, I'd have laughed in your face." The mayor chuckled. Sometimes redemption stories write themselves. As John continued his work, one person had remained noticeably distant, Veronica. Despite her willingness to work alongside him, she had never openly addressed the pain he had caused her. One evening, after a long meeting, John found her sitting alone in the empty conference room. Taking a deep breath, he approached. "You've never really told me how you feel about all this," he said cautiously. Veronica glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "What do you want me to say, John? That I forgive you?" John exhaled slowly. "No, I just want to know the truth." She leaned back, folding her arms. "The truth? The truth is, I spent years hating you. The truth is, I wanted you to suffer the way you made people like me suffer. And the truth is, I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you." John nodded, accepting her words without argument. "But," she continued, surprising him, "I can see you're trying, and that matters." She met his eyes, and for the first time, there was no resentment in them. Only honesty. "Keep doing the work, John. That's the only way you can make up for the past." John nodded, understanding that this was the closest thing to redemption he would ever receive from her, and it was enough. Months passed, and John's efforts bore fruit. Policies were implemented, training programs were overhauled, and for the first time, trust between the police and the community was beginning to rebuild. One day, the mayor approached him with a final offer. "We need new leadership in the department," the mayor said. "People trust you now, John. I want you to consider stepping into a higher role, chief of police." John was stunned. A year ago, he had been the embodiment of everything wrong with the system. Now he was being asked to lead change from the top, but he knew the truth. He had spent so much time fighting for reform outside the system that he wasn't sure if being inside it was the right place for him anymore. After careful consideration, John made his decision. "Thank you, Mayor," he said, "but I think my place is here with the people. I could do more good working alongside them than I can behind a desk." The mayor nodded, respecting his choice, and so John continued his work as an activist, an advocate, and a living example that change was possible, not just in policies, but in people. Years later, John would look back at his journey with a sense of purpose. He wasn't perfect, he never would be, but he had dedicated his life to making things right, not just for himself, but for those who had suffered because of people like him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.